Welcome to Chapter 6 of PSYC 379. This chapter is looking at emotions. So the first thing that I want to do is actually define emotion or affect. And this is an evaluative response that typically includes some combination of physiological arousal, behavioral expression, and subjective experience, which can be positive, negative, or ambivalent. Now, emotions are also sometimes referred to as feelings, subjective experience, or affect, and they're typically also conceptualized as transient and neurophysiological reactions to events. So when emotions are triggered, they prepare a person to deal with an event, so in some way they are functional. So it can be surprisingly difficult to actually list emotions. So I want you to just take a second and list as many emotions as you possibly can in 30 seconds and challenge yourself to see if you can come up with more than 10 different types of emotions. Now that you've had the opportunity to try to generate as many emotions as you could in 30 seconds, you can take a look at this feelings faces sheet and see how many of these you might have gotten, how many of these you might be surprised that you didn't put on your list. And while by no means is this a comprehensive list of emotions, it does provide a pretty wide variety of emotions that, for the most part, people are not able to generate just thinking off the top of their head. There are 6 basic emotions recognized in Western academic psychology: anger, joy, fear, surprise, disgust, and sadness. And these basic emotions are triggered by biologically innate systems in our brains, which we have from birth and are considered to be relatively universal. And we share these emotions with our non-human primates as well. But humans are uniquely able to consider themselves and others. So we also have self-focused emotions, and these self-conscious emotions are often associated with reflective processes, things that we learn as we develop all the way through adulthood, and are most likely going to be shaped more through culture. And these are feelings like shame, guilt, pride, and embarrassment. The cultural calibration of emotions. Cultures create rules, guidelines, values, and norms on regulating emotions. And cultural regulation of emotion occurs via regulating our biologically based basic emotions, helping to construct unique emotional experiences by going beyond basic emotions, and helping to construct unique concepts, meanings, attitudes, values, and beliefs about emotion. Essentially, culture provides coordination and organization of social complexities. And Charles Darwin actually talked about this in his theory of evolution, where facial expressions of emotions were biologically based and also adaptive. So facial expressions actually help us to survive. People express emotions on their faces in the same way, regardless of race or culture, according to this theory. And this allows us to help communicate with other people. And there's actually a really interesting, Paul Ekman has done a lot of really interesting research, but there's a little clip that I've included. It's both in the notes section as well as actually on the slide itself, that's looking at the study of facial expression of emotion, where he talks about why I have a face. Now, there are several key theories of emotions that the chapter talked about and that I'll be presenting here. One of the pioneers in the field, William James, offered a theory that emotions are embedded in bodily experience. So physical experience leads a person to feel emotionally aroused, and that arousal stimulates the subjective experience of feelings like anxiety, joy, and so forth. So physical experiences led to subjective experiences of emotion. And according to James, people don't jump and clap their hands because they're happy. Rather, they become happy because they're jumping and clapping their hands. Now, about 40 years later, Cannon and Bard published an alternative outlook known as the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion. It's quite nice how you can name things after yourself when you come up with them. But according to this approach, various life situations, like a hairy spider crawling on your shoulder, can simultaneously elicit both an emotional reaction like disgust or fear, as well as a bodily response such as increased blood pressure or sweaty palms. In the 1960s, there was another theory of emotion that gained popularity among psychologists. And according to the theory's authors, there are two crucial elements of emotional experience. There's physiological arousal and the cognitive interpretation of this arousal. In every emotion, we first experience a state of physiological arousal, and then we try to explain to ourselves what that arousal means. If the situation suggests that we should experience pleasure, we call it joy. If somebody threatens us, we would call this experience fear. Now, all of these theories were created in Western psychology. However, I want you to think, do they apply cross-culturally? So to answer this, we have to look at at least two basic alternatives. So according to one, all human emotions are universal. They have a similar underlying physiological mechanism, and the specific cultural environment only applies some makeup on the human affect. The other alternative emphasizes both the cultural origin and cultural specificity of emotions. And according to this view, all human emotions develop in specific cultural conditions and therefore can be best understood primarily within that particular cultural context. So one way this is studied is through facial expressions of emotions. So are facial expressions learned, or are they innate? And Dr. David Matsumoto of San Francisco State researched this issue by studying blind and sighted athletes in the 2004 Paralympic Games. And there's a really interesting, another short, but really interesting YouTube video clip that I posted on the slide as well as in the notes section. And both this video and the previous video are less than 3 minutes long. So if you're interested, I would highly recommend looking at it. So on this slide, there's some kind of key facts about the facial expressions of emotion. So one is there are universal signs found in babies: smiling, distaste, disgust, and crying. And there's a perfect correspondence between facial behaviors produced between blind and sighted individuals, and similarities between human expressions of emotions and non-human primates displayed in similar contexts. So which theories do you think that these might support or start to dispute? Or what are some additional questions that you would want to ask before you are going to say whether or not these supported any one of the two theories that were just talked about on this slide? So on this slide, I just wanted to put a screenshot of the Dr. Matsumoto book, also on culture and psychology. It's another book that's sometimes used in applied cross-cultural psychology classes all across the country. But I'm posting it here because the next couple of slides I'm taking pictures and research cited specifically from his textbook. So on this slide, we're looking at, again, the facial expressions of emotion, and he's comparing blind athletes' facial expressions with sighted athletes' facial expressions. And the researchers took pictures of spontaneously produced emotions, and again, this was at the 2004 Olympics and as well as the Paralympic Games in Athens. And there was almost perfect correspondence between blind and sighted athletes. And most of the blind athletes were blind from birth, so this controls for the idea that the facial expressions were learned and then somehow they went blind after they already knew how to react. And this might then suggest that humans are born with an ability to express different emotions in different ways. pictures, so I'm including more research on the pictures and individuals' ability to recognize emotions. And this is taken from an Ekman and Matsumoto study, which was looking at strong agreement across cultures as to which expression someone is portraying, which suggests that a lot of emotions are universally recognizable. So not only is emotional expression similar, the faces that we make, the expressions that we're having, not only are those similar, but our ability to recognize emotions could also be universal as well. The last couple of slides have presented arguments about how emotions are universal, that people can tell other people's emotions even if we don't speak their language. We might be able to tell if they're happy or if they're sad. So if you understand what other people feel by judging their emotional expressions, and if they can judge your emotions correctly, then that is a pretty strong argument for human feelings being universal. And that's actually what Darwin suggested in his famous 1872 work, Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. So what I'd like you to do is just take a look at these pictures and see, can you identify the different emotions being portrayed? And then, while you're looking at these, I just also wanted to add that there's another interesting argument about the similarities in human emotions that's derived from numerous studies about the process of identification, description, and explanation of emotional expression or emotion recognition. And this is research on cross-cultural recognition of emotional intonation in the voice, and that this research has yielded some similar results, that people typically identify the speaking person's emotion in cases where the speaker uses a foreign tongue and the voice is recorded on tape. I think it's also really interesting that there is an amazing similarity in the way people name emotions across cultures and languages. So in other languages, there are equivalent words for virtually every English term for emotions. All languages make distinctions between positive and negative affect, and this distinction is explained to young children who begin to use words and phrases such as nice, mean, good, bad, I like, and I don't like at a very early age. So all in all, supporters of the idea of the universality of human emotion argue that similar emotions exist in all cultures, and that we react to external events and bodily signals with similar facial expressions, physiological changes, and subjective experiences of pleasure or displeasure. Cross-culturally, individuals are emotionally sensitive to the loss of relatives and friends, the birth of their children, the victories of their favorite sports teams, and criticisms from others. Across cultures, sadness can cause crying, anger can provoke aggression, and joy often helps people to forgive. In addition to similarities of emotional experience, there's also differences in emotional experience. And differences in emotional experience, linguistic variety in the labeling of emotions, and distinct socialization practices all suggest culture-specific origins of human emotions. According to this view, people's emotions vary because they're based on different experiences that are going to be related to the culture in which they originate. So despite some similarities in emotional experiences across culture, there's no one single universal description of basic emotions. In the Buddhist tradition, accepted in Chinese language, for example, the basic 7 emotions are described as happiness, anger, sorrow, joy, love, hate, and desire. There's no disgust, for example, in this lineup. A study of ancient Chinese texts reflecting on dominant philosophers including Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and they found various sets of noted emotions ranging from 5 to 7. Their English translations of all of the emotional labels, totaling 12 names, do not include disgust. And recent studies of emotion recognition showed that subjects in China compared to other groups had more problems with recognition of disgust on photographed faces. Now, I do have to apologize if I'm mispronouncing any of the names from these studies, but a study by Shigeru Oishi and his colleagues surveyed more than 350 college students in Japan, Korea, and the US. And they found that on average, European Americans report to be happier than Asian Americans, Koreans, or Japanese. However, European Americans became emotionally distracted by negative events, for example, getting a parking ticket or receiving a bad grade, and recover from these setbacks slower than their counterparts of Asian ancestry. Alternatively, Koreans, Japanese, and to a lesser extent Asian Americans report that they're less happy in general, but recover to their normal emotional state faster than European Americans. So there's a couple of different theories that have been presented about the cultural specificity of emotions or the universality of emotions. We've talked about how emotions can be expressed in similar or different ways or identified in similar or different ways. And emotions can be seen as similar or different because we perceive, analyze, and think about them from different points of view. Cultural differences in emotions tend to grow larger as the level of description becomes more concrete. So for example, we can generally consider jealousy as sadness. Alternatively, by applying like a magnifying glass, for example, from the picture, for more detailed analysis, jealousy might be interpreted as a blend of anger, fear, sadness, and frustration. High levels of abstraction cause us to see people from different cultures or social groups as similar in their emotions. For a more comprehensive cross-cultural analysis of emotions, we might want to look inside the emotion first. So first, looking again at the definition, we should try to understand the emotion as a multi-componential process. So first, one, an emotion is initiated. And then two, there's an underlying physiological process for the emotion. 3, the emotion is experienced. 4, then it's displayed or remains hidden. And 5, it somehow affects our decisions. 6, the emotion may cause other emotions, and eventually it fades away. Now, in the definition for emotion, we had talked about how they're typically conceptualized as neurophysiological reactions to an event. So how then do people from different cultures actually interpret these triggers, antecedents, or preceding events, however we want to term them, that are connected with different emotions? So I want you to ask yourself, do people across cultures agree that certain situations should elicit similar reactions? So for example, do all people concede that the loss of a friend is a sad event, that the birth of a child is a happy one? And actually, this might be surprising, but while this is certainly not true for everyone, and there are certainly extenuating circumstances, there is more than ample research to confirm that this is actually the case, that cross-culturally, basic emotions are generally marked by similar types of events. So these events happen, but how do people evaluate their emotions? And despite tremendous individual variations, there are some cultural norms and rules that regulate our evaluations of emotions. There's evidence that people may carry cultural beliefs about emotions which are most significant or suitable to particular social rules or social settings. So for example, some emotions could be considered inappropriate and therefore suppressed, such as feeling envious of your brother or sister's success. Other emotions, though, might be absolutely legitimate and even desirable, such as feeling joy after recovering from an illness. These evaluations are attached to the situation in which an emotional response is anticipated. So pay attention, for example, to how many people react to so-called ethnic jokes. They may laugh at a joke that ridicules a member of a particular ethnic group if the joke teller is a representative of the ethnic group about which the joke is being told. If there's not an ethnic match, per se, between the teller and the joke, or the teller is not your good friend, you might end up feeling upset or even angry. Feeling rules rules are defined by the book as cultural norms and regulations about how to feel in particular situations. And one important application of the study of feeling rules is growing understanding that people can manage their emotional states. So there's cross-cultural evidence, for example, that people can influence their levels of happiness by learning how to feel positive, or from a cognitive behavioral perspective, how to more accurately or helpfully interpret their cognitions. So cultural values and individual experiences are helpful. Studies show support for the Buddhist view that many people are unhappy because they choose the wrong goals in life. What people think will make them happy, such as material possessions or kind of other more materialistic goals, does not necessarily, or in the most cases, does not actually lead to lasting well-being. This slide is looking specifically at assessing emotions. When people try to assess their emotional experience, they make assessments not only about the experience of the emotion along with the dimensions of pleasure or displeasure, but also along several other dimensions. So, for example, people try to determine whether their emotions, 1, are caused by a familiar or unfamiliar event, 2, suggest the existence of an obstacle, 3, create a sense of being in charge or of being out of control, 4, increase or decrease self-esteem, and 5, cause praise, reproach, or mockery by one's group. So there are at least 2 criteria for assessment of emotional expressions: frequency and intensity. For example, in the U.S., many parents commonly say "I love you" to their children and vice versa. Contrarily, in the Ukraine, Russia, or Belarus, such a verbal expression of affection is considered to be too strong and intrusive and may be expressed only in a few critical life situations. Now, this slide is looking specifically at the expression of emotions. And the book defines display rules as patterns of emotional expression considered appropriate within a particular culture, age, or social group. And display rules differ not only by culture but also by gender. Some evidence suggests that women probably express emotions more intensely and openly than men do. And this is true for all emotions except for anger. Women are generally, according to these studies, more comfortable in displaying emotions such as love, happiness, shame, guilt, and sympathy, which foster affiliation and caregiving. Men, however, avoid these soft emotions that display, according to some opinions, male vulnerabilities. For men raised in traditional cultures, a complex emotion of honor consists of being in control of their own family and of outperforming or impressing other men. Women's honor in these cultures consists of conforming to the rules of modesty and faithfulness. So it's not necessarily the experience or interpretation of emotion, it's the expression of emotion that might be more dictated by cultural context. Throughout the history of human civilization, one way of managing an emotion has been to learn how to control its manifestation. It's interesting that such display rules are primarily concerned with the restraining of emotional expressions. Beginning presumably with the Chinese thinker Confucius around the 5th century BCE and the Greek philosopher Plato around the 4th century BCE, emotion has been viewed as a disruptive force in human affairs. Plato asserted that reason must restrain the passions, which otherwise distort rational thinking, which is clearly prioritized. Aristotle and Democritus, around the 4th century BCE, had a similar view, suggesting that emotions are located in the lower, more primitive level of the soul, whereas thinking is located in the higher, more advanced layers. Most major world religions, for example, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and Christianity, introduced the rules of which human beings could become independent of the destructive, quote-unquote, emotional forces such as envy, pride, vanity, and jealousy. Emotion and behavioral intention, or the inclination to act, has also been found to have an interesting relationship. Significant cross-cultural similarities were found where joy caused more approach behaviors, whereas anger elicited more aggressive behaviors, and withdrawal was the most common reaction to sadness, disgust, shame, and guilt. And finally, we're talking about emotion and judgment. And people who experience positive affect differ from those who experience negative affect. The former have better memory and use different strategies for problem solving and categorization. Anger can be found to lead to more personal accusations, whereas sadness leads to a tendency to understand and forgive circumstances as much more due to fate, chance, or unluckiness. And this isn't to say that people experience any one type of emotion all of the time or even the majority of the time, but while you're in this mental space, your perception is going to be affected and you're going to make different types of judgments than you might in a different type of emotional space. So that's the end of this chapter. Please remember to complete the discussion board post as well as the Chapter 6 quiz. Okay, have a great week.